Right, hello and welcome back to another video. So today we're going to be talking about the Benoni defense, in particular the Mon Benoni, which is what we have on the board right now. For those of you who are not aware, we get these via the moves d4, knight f6, c4, and instead of going for something very solid, like maybe the Nimzo Indian with e6 or bishop b4, or maybe something like the King's Indian defense, where, you know, we play in a very hyper-modern style where we let white grab the whole center like this, we decide to very immediately create some confrontation in the center by playing this move c5, striking at the d4 pawn, when white will most often just simply advance it with d5. This is by far the best move, and black has a couple of different options in this position. One very well known one is the Benko Gambit, but another defense which is also quite playable and also quite exciting is the Mon Benoni with e6, and this is exactly what we're going to be talking about in today's video. And in particular, for those who are looking for a very exciting dynamic opening against 1d4 that's not boring, you can play it for a win, this is going to be the video for you. But without further ado, let's get right into things. We're going to be starting with the first section, which is queenside play. Okay, so this is going to be the first part. We're going to be talking about black's queenside play in the Benoni, or maybe also white's in some cases. And the way I split this video up, the first part is going to be on, generally speaking, the queenside play that black will pursue, and also the second part will be how black or white once again can pursue play in the kingside, or also sort of the center. I just split the video up into these two parts. It might not be completely perfect, that split, but at least for me in trying to teach this opening, that was the way that felt like made the most sense to me, so that's what we're going to be doing. And so the very first idea, this is probably one of the most fundamental ideas of the Benoni, where, okay, let's put a couple moves on the board. This is all theoretical stuff. I should note also knight takes d5 is sort of possible, but generally speaking, if white plays like this and tries to maintain a piece on d5, black is very quickly just going to play moves like knight 6, d6, bishop e6, and contest the white control of the d5 square and have absolutely no problems, which is why white basically almost always takes with the c pawn. And after d6, at some point very often again they'll play e4, and we have this very characteristic structure for the Mon Benoni where white clearly has this central majority, but at the same time black also has a queenside majority, which is going to be a very defining characteristic of this position and the, you know, way that both sides play this position. But to give some further developing moves, g6, this is all very standard stuff. This is called the classical variation where white plays bishop e2, castles, and black has a couple of different options in this position, but one which is very logical and often is played in just about every variation of Benoni at some point is to play a6, preparing b5, and generally considered speaking quite risky for black to allow this sort of b5 push, because if we're allowed to say play b5, b4, kick this knight away and gain a lot of space, then the e4 pawn, for example, could become quite weak and we could maybe just take it. Which is why white will very often in these positions to stop b5 by playing a4. I'd say around 95-96% of the time, this is what white will do against black playing a6. I will show later on also how sometimes white actually doesn't need to prevent a move like b5 with a4, but again, moving on to the next thing. Again, coming back to this position, a very common line that white will pursue is to play h3 in this position, and after some developing moves like this, bishop d3. And this is in fact one of the most, I'm not sure critical, but it's definitely one of the most popular lines against Mon Benoni. A lot of repertoire books, like around 10 so years ago, recommend this line. I'm not sure about anymore, but it's definitely a fairly respectable choice for the white player. And also one thing worth noting with this move h3 is, generally speaking, very often the opening, right? Like a move like h3, you need to be careful playing it, because if you just play h3 for no reason, you're just sort of wasting time. But there's a very specific reason in Benoni that we want to do this. We're going to talk more about this later in the second half of this video, in that it prevents this move bishop g4, and this light squared bishop is often a very problematic piece in the Benoni for black. And so, you know, because we can't put it on d7, well we could, but you know, sort of prevents black's knight from coming to this d7 square, which it often wants to. Can't go to e6, can't go to f5, so very often the only logical square left for it is g4, but obviously when white plays h3 themselves, it takes away that option. But nonetheless, we don't need to fret here. We have a very nice move actually in this position, which is to not even play a6, but actually to play b5 immediately, and this is something that you need to watch out for in the Benoni. Very often, you know, you need to play in a very energetic way to avoid sort of getting suffocated, and there are some other playable moves, I think, like knight h5 in this position, and then trying to go for a quick knight d7, jump a knight into e5, stuff like this. Also very often just trying to rush in with the f-pawn by playing f5, but for the purposes of this segment, I'd like to focus on b5, which is also considered to be like the theoretically best move. And what you're probably all wondering at this point is like, well, some of you may know what the idea is, but let's say white just takes on b5, what's the whole point, right? We're just down a pawn. But the whole point is that we can actually play knight takes e4, and if the king was already castled, this wouldn't work at all. But now after knight takes e4, we can exploit the sort of temporary poor coordination of the white pieces by playing queen a5 check, forking the king and bishop like this. So they play knight c3, protecting the bishop. We can take, giving up our darks with bishop, which might not seem so good, but at the same time, white also can't castle, so we get that. And in fact, in this position, I think white is just clearly worse. We can also like bring our bishop to the a6 square, maybe get that guy involved in the attack. So usually all white will do in this position is play like knight fd2, and there's like all this theory that happens in this position, but just trust me that black is doing fine. And after b5, let's say knight takes b5. In this case, you know, this is a very specific theoretical thing. You go like rook e8 instead of playing knight takes e4, because after takes queen a5 check. Now after this bishop takes c3 exchange, it's not quite the same, because after something like takes bishop d2, white has the bishop here. We're not really able to prevent the white king from castling. It's just not really the same as this variation. So we should avoid this whole thing. Instead of playing knight takes e4, in this position we should just play rook e8. And if white tries to go back with the knight now we're going to play knight takes e4. But there's a slightly different idea, which is that now after white takes on e4 whichever way, we're going to play f5 and win back the piece like this. This is also somewhat of a common tactical theme that occurs in various lines of the Benoni. To show another common tactical sort of below in the Benoni, however, it can very often occur after the following moves. Let's say white does not develop the knight to f3, which would transpose to our other line we're just looking at. After b5, they play bishop g5, and sort of one potential argument could be that now you can't really play b5, because after takes, I mean, knight takes e4 doesn't really go anywhere, because, you know, the pin, right? But what white can say is, you know, fair enough, okay, I'll just play rook e8. And if white plays knight f3 in this position, what black can do actually is just play this move c4, kicking away this bishop temporarily, since if you take, well, it might sort of look like what's the point? We can't really play like knight takes e4 because our queen's gonna hang, but actually we can, because now after takes, knight takes e3 check, well, actually it's also discovered attack on the queen, and after all the following exchanges, we're gonna find that what has happened is black has just won a piece, which is why in this position, white usually should not take on c4 and should instead play bishop c2. But again, we can play very energetically, no time to waste. We're going to play b5, and if white takes again on b5, this time we're going to play queen a5 check, forking the king and the knight, forcing knight to 3. But after knight takes e4, win back material, lots of pressure, definitely not a good position for the white pieces. Which is why, you know, white probably wants to in this position, so taking, go castles. But after a6, you know, we've been talking earlier about how, generally speaking, if black can sort of establish this sort of b5 move in the position, very often they're doing fairly well, and I would say this is no real exception to that. If in the next few moves, for example, we can play like a knight to d7, then to c5, play bishop d7, start pushing our queenside pawns, I'd say we're doing pretty good. And just to show another example of this break in action, I'm going to show a game that Bobby Fischer played back in his heyday where the following moves occurred: f4, a bit of a weird version of the 4 pawns attack, which usually occurs with f4. It's considered the best way to play this is very energetically with this check on b5, when black has to be careful to play knight of d7, because if you, after bishop b5 check, play knight b7 instead, and then e5, this is quite problematic. If you just move the knight anywhere, I think e6 is quite problematic. And also if you instead play like bishop d7, I think still e5 is quite bad, because like after takes, for example, like this is under attack, and this is also sort of a threat. Yeah, you kind of want to avoid this, which is why knight of d7 is usually moved. You try to fight back. A lot of typical stuff here you need to know. Won't exactly go into all the details in this video, but again, bishop e2 was played this game, bishop g7, f4. It's all standard looking moves: rook e8, knight d2, a very common move to try and defend this pawn, and Bobby played a very nice move in this position, just c4. The point is to just gain some space on the queen side, while at the same time not really making it easy for black to really take the thing, because if they take this, well, knight takes e4, and now we've deflected this bishop away from the e file, which makes it so that after takes f5, and we have this very thematic tactic, winning back the piece on the next move. And if, say, instead knight takes e4, well, that's a lot simple. We just win back the pawn and no problemo. And, you know, if white tries to play a bit more protectively, they play like bishop f3 or something, we can just play, again, the standard stuff I was saying earlier: knight d7, b5, and they can't take, queen b6 check, another very typical tactic. And if they avoid this with something like king h1, a6, and we can just continue playing in very standard fashion. on the queen side in this game. Bobby's opponent tried to sacrifice a pawn. It didn't really work out, and he ended up going on to win the game later on. So earlier we were talking about how in one of the just constant revolving themes of the Benoni is black playing a6 and b5, but I thought it would be worth showing some examples of where white doesn't try to play a4 to stop black from doing this, and one such example could be his bishop f4 variation, a very popular variation, one that I actually like to quite play with the white pieces myself. But usually in this position, if I have it, I will play a4, simply stopping b5. This is also the main line, but one very tricky sideline is for white to play knight d2, just simply saying, you know, black, come at me with your b5 stuff. And I think this is also probably the best move for black, but they have to be very careful after a4, b4, knight c4. By the way, for those of you who want like very precise theory, I think like knight h5 is supposed to be a bit better in this position than going b4. But let's say b4, knight c4, this is still all playable for black, takes. Black has to be very precise in this position and plays very aggressive move f5, when white should reply with knight g5, and if they don't, they go something like knight d2. Well, now our bishop on f4 is very like awkwardly placed, and we can get here with g5. Again, it's not really what I'm trying to show here, I'm just showing this stuff exists, but the main important idea to grasp from a strategic point of view is that as black, if you play this sort of way with b4, you leave this sort of weak square on c4. If you just play slow positional moves, like say bishop f5, I think this is the most popular move in the Lee chess database, and it's very bad actually, because after knight d2, what we're going to have is a solid outpost for our knight in c4. We can play e4 next, kicking away this bishop as well, where actually it's very difficult for black to just do anything. Like for example, already I think they just developed the bishop g7, this might be a mistake. You might need to develop it this way, because after knight c4, how exactly are you defending like d6? Maybe you're not, right? So if you have to go back, for example, to do that, already it just shows you like how desperate the black position is. But you know, this position is something I really want you guys to keep in mind. Whenever you're playing Benoni and you sort of have this option of, you know, going b5 and your opponent lets you do that, always sort of ask yourself, you know, can my opponent play a4, get a knight on c4 like this, and sort of achieve this sort of strategic dream? Or at the very least, is there a way, like say in this position, okay, they're like 2 moves away from achieving that, but is there a way I can play very energetically to sort of, you know, make it at least very hard for them to do that? Like for example, after f5, they can't really play knight d2 again, because, you know, you get b5 and you trap this bishop because f4 next, which again forces them to go to g5, but this is getting way off course to where they actually want to go to begin with, which was the c4 square. So once again, we're going to be talking about the b5 break. This is something that just crops up again and again in this variation. So yeah, we're talking about just briefly like this whole variation where white after a6 plays knight d2 and provokes black into making all these weaknesses on the queen side, which they have to play very precisely to make sure it doesn't sort of get out of control. But instead of looking at something slightly more mainstream, a4, very typical developing moves for both sides rather. Queen e7, knight b7, all this stuff. Knight e8 is sort of a bit of a multi-purpose move. One idea could potentially be to go to c7, support, you know, again, the b5 break. That is very typical for this whole variation. But another potential idea is also to make way for the knight to go to the d6 square eventually, which might sort of sound like Sam, like what the hell, that's illegal, right? But the whole point is that, you know, if we let's just play any random move, knight e5 we play, and we have some sort of situation like white takes us, say go back or something. Now all of a sudden you can see the appeal in having the knight here where it can readily go to the d6 square, blockade this past d pawn, and now sort of have a very nice view of the whole board. It controls the queen side, it also controls the center and the king side. This is a very, not even just applicable to the Benoni, but also just a very important strategic idea to know in general, I guess. But nonetheless, let's say a5. Very often when white plays this, what they're sort of saying is like, okay, I'm just going to clamp down the queen side now, and if you ever play b5 in the future, you're creating some serious positional weaknesses, for example, like with this isolated a pawn. But very often we have to understand is that as white, you probably shouldn't be playing a5 yet, unless black is literally on the verge of having b5 prepared and there's nothing you can do to stop it, in which point a5 kind of makes sense. Because very often after a5, what black is going to do is they're going to say like, you know what, I don't really care, like, okay, sure, you can say like, you create positional weaknesses after this, but I'm still going to do this and sort of have like active play along the b file. Maybe I can bring like my knight to c7, then go to b5. Definitely couldn't do that before for pawn a4. And all in all, like, it's, you know, not a bad position for the black pieces necessarily. Definitely some clear ideas for counterplay. So as white always being a little bit cautious about going for a5, a lot of people just like to fling this move out without really thinking at all. And also for the black player, of course, always remember that you can definitely just go for b5 anyway. You don't necessarily have to worry about like all these positional weaknesses. You can compensate like in this variation with your active piece play. And there's going to be some, you know, better versions of this, some worse versions, but that's going to come with the experience of playing this opening. So the position we have on the board right now, again, sort of looks like a very typical Benoni sort of thing. We have a slightly different variation to what we been looking at earlier with a bishop on g2. This is called the fianchetto variation. Black plays rook b8 in this position. One of the cons of the fianchetto variation is that since the bishop isn't on this diagonal, it doesn't help control the b5 break as well. And also in general, I would probably argue that the fianchetto variation is one of the less critical variations, but that's a bit of a different discussion. But nonetheless, you know, like, how do we deal with black about to, you know, being playing this whole move b5? Like, what exactly do we do, right? And, you know, we could play a5, but again, as I mentioned earlier, something like b5 takes. Black has a lot of counterplay. I'd probably say they're not doing too badly here, especially since in the other variations, right, with bishop on this diagonal, at least we could sort of target that pawn, but in this variation we don't even have that. So what happened in this game between two decent players, one 2100, the other 2300, the player with white decided to play this move rook b1, which is a relatively innocuous looking move at first, but the whole point is they go for the couple moves down the line. Black plays b5. Well, white's whole idea was to take on b5 and after takes to actually play this move b4, just completely stopping these pawns in their tracks. And one important point to understand is that if black plays c4, it might sort of look bad at first because, you know, they gain this passed c pawn. How could we, well, not only just pass, but pass protected c pawn? How on earth could we allow something like this in our good conscience, right? But basically what white is arguing is that, well, it doesn't really matter a whole lot because we're blockading the pawn to begin with our knight. Also, the b5 pawn is a little bit weak. The knight on c5, well, sorry, the knight on d7 rather, can't jump into c5. I was just thinking about that square. Also, one weird habit I've noticed, this is a complete side tangent, but I've noticed sometimes when I like think about a move, when I play like an over the board game, I write it down, but instead of writing the like actual move down, like my opponent plays like, I don't know, let's say they play like rook a8 or something, I'll be like, oh, the rook can go to a3. So for some reason, instead of like writing rook a8 down, I'll write like rook a3 down. It's a really weird thing I've noticed in some of my games. Completely off topic, but I thought that was a bit funny to share. But also, in addition to those other factors, potentially a knight could be coming to d4. Of course, for now, we can't because we're just hanging the piece. But say if we brought like a rook to d1 maybe, and then we play knight d4, does black really want to give up their, you know, dark sword bishop if we can recapture? I don't know, right? So that's something that they have to really keep in mind. So what instead happened in this game was bishop a6, but, you know, does your bishop really want to be on a6? No, not really. That's not what exactly dreamed of in its childhood. So e4, some further typical moves, you know, bishop f1, targeting this b5 pawn, potentially as a long-term weakness to target, knight a2, and finally black cracked. They decide to play c takes b4, but after queen d1 and all these moves, we now have a long-term weakness established of this b5 pawn. We can bring a knight into the b4 outpost, potentially use the a file to exploit for our heavy pieces. All in all, definitely a nice sequence of positional moves from white, just showing the power of, you know, this rook b1 plan. It's not good in every variation necessarily. It's definitely very common in the fianchetto variation, I will say, but just keep this one in mind. It does look a little bit weird at first, you know, the whole rook b1 b4 thing, but it definitely can be very effective at stopping black from being active on the queen side. So this is a position I had actually not so long ago, maybe like about a month and a half ago, maybe it was more like 2 months actually now that I think about it. Basically, I was actually on the white side. I was playing a FIDE master who had the black pieces. And basically one thing that was on both of our minds in this game was that, you know, white at some point wants to put a knight on the c4 square. Often when it's on d2, it was initially on f3, very often white will maneuver this knight to d2 and then to c4, where it can then sort of put some pressure on the queen side, also the d6 pawn, potentially can also support this very typical f4 e5 plan later on. However, what you sort of have to understand is that, okay, well, first of all, sure, my opponent played, he played h6 in the game. Not so relevant to what we're talking about right now, but it's you know, if White wants to play a move like knight c4, you might sort of be like, okay, I'm not so sure about like this whole variation where Black takes on e4, White takes on d6, they get past d pawn, maybe this is a bit unpleasant, at least I thought that way during the game. And so this knight c4 move, you might be tempted to just play some move like queen c7 or queen e7 protecting the d6 pawn. But usually what Black's best response to this whole knight c4 thing to do is play knight b6. You could also maybe consider knight e5, sometimes this is playable as well, but usually knight b6 is sort of the way you go about this. Sometimes you have to be careful about something like getting hit with something like bishop f4 or like f4 when White could be gaining a lot of tempi. So yeah, I think in this sort of situation, usually what you want to do, if you can at least, is to play this move knight b6, where you essentially challenge the knight on c4 and put White in a bit of an awkward situation where they don't really want to take, because generally speaking in Benoni with White's sort of space advantage, making piece exchanges is not in really their best interest unless there's some sort of concrete benefit to doing so. So Black has already freed their position a lot, not to mention there's immediate threats like knight takes e4, queen takes b2 in the position. White really wants to stay like as far away from this as possible, and you also don't want to play something like f3 and just keeping the tension, because again, like maybe this is a bit better than this variation, right? But even still, you don't want to exchange pieces off like this. Black is probably going to play something like, I don't know, knight d7, knight e5, maybe just like bishop d7, b5 next, not too sure. And again, if White plays something like a5, probably just b5 and, you know, steamroll head in the queenside, very typical counterplay like this. Which more or less means that White's best option is usually to respond to this move knight b6 as a strange looking knight a3 move, or knight d2 going back to where you came from. But the problem with knight a3 in this variation, of course, is that it hangs a pawn like this, and the problem with knight d2 is that, well, we could just repeat the position like this now, and given that White generally has a better position than Benoni, and now this will always depend on what the game circumstance is, like are you playing a higher or lower rated player, but just from a purely objective point of view, it's not good for White if they have to repeat moves like this. This is not something they want to do. Which, coming back to this position, means that, you know, White probably has to find something else to do in the meantime to try and prepare this move knight c4, because again, knight b6 is just very annoying to deal with. A somewhat common way of doing this might be to play like, say, a5, and that's what I actually played in the game to prepare knight c4. Let's just say some random move like, I don't know, king h7. Now with knight c4, of course, knight b6 is impossible, and if you go b5 takes, knight takes b6 is forced. Oh, well, actually, in all this variation, actually, if you go b5, there's knight takes d6, but if we pretend that doesn't exist for whatever reason, and go for this variation, what White will often do is play knight a5, and now we'll try and go into the c6 square, which is a bit of an annoying outpost, and also, like, if you defend it with something like this, then you probably hang the a6 pawn, e4 is also hanging at the same time. There's a lot of tactics, but it's just worth keeping in mind that sort of, this is better for White, where you can go knight e5, than, like, this whole thing where, you know, you have to like go back or make an exchange. You don't want to do this as the White pieces, and as Black you're happy to play a move like knight b6. So again, looking at the fianchetto variation where, you know, White has a bishop on g2, not the best thing, I've gone over this before. We're going to be talking briefly about what can happen when Black puts knight on a6. This is a very common idea aside from just trying to go for the standard a6, you know, a4, to put a knight on d7 sort of shit that you've seen a million times. Sometimes Black will also put a knight on a6 and then maneuver this guy to c7, then try to go b5 like that. And sort of the argument is, right, is by putting the knight on a6 first, and then going to c7, then doing a6, b5, whatever, you sort of have one extra guy sort of helping out with the progression of the whole queenside plan, so why the hell not, right? But you have to be slightly careful when you play in such a fashion, let's say progressing a few moves forward like this, boom, 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 that you are sort of neglecting the center. In particular, with the knight not being on d7, you aren't really controlling the e5 square, which means that you should probably in this position take a bit of a time out to play something like knight d7, preventing something like e5, because if you play b5 immediately, a very tempting move, this is actually a severe mistake after takes e5, where, you know, White has this sort of, you know, somewhat principled approach of beating a flank attack with a center attack, right? As if, you know, Black takes this, White crashes through with knight on e5, this guy can come to the c6 square, very powerful pass protected d pawn as well. So yeah, just be aware whenever you want to put a knight on a6 and you see some person, you know, getting through the b5 break, and you once again have this sort of delusion that you think if you get through the b5 break you're winning. Sometimes, don't get me wrong, once again, it can be very strong, but you always have to be careful about other factors in the position, like white just sort of steamrolling ahead and trying to go e4, e5, and that if you do go for something like this, you'll probably have to play with a little bit of precision and play something like knight d7 first. And so for the second part of this video, there's also going to be a third, which I forgot to mention earlier. It's going to be a lot smaller than these other two parts, though. It's going to be on playing on the king side and also the center. I think the center play ties in a little bit more than the queen side thing. But yeah, to start off with, the first idea we're going to be talking about is, once again, as I briefly mentioned earlier, knight squared bishop on c8. How do we deal with this, and more specifically, trading it off? So, as we mentioned earlier, h3, a good move to stop something like bishop g4, but allow also something like b5. By playing castles, b5 is not an issue. However, it does allow something like this, where now black can play bishop g4. And by the way, this is actually a game of Michal Tal, a big practitioner of the Benoni back in his time, where, you know, the following moves happened, knight bd7. And just notice now how, compared to a couple moves earlier, like, just say if white could get in, like, I don't know, say we play some random move, h3. I know this is a completely terrible move, by the way. Never play a5 in the Benoni. No, just don't do that. But this is essentially now just a very difficult position for black to play, or at least a lot more harder than if they're able to play something like this to trade off their light squared bishop, because their camp is just a lot less cramped now. It's a lot easier to develop everything harmoniously. The following game continued like so, bringing the rooks to these files. Bishop c4, knight e5, very nice move. If takes, and you try to, you know, play in the center with f4. Doesn't really lead anywhere, unfortunately, after it's like rook e7 and bringing this other rook to e8. And again, with all these pieces getting traded off, it's just not really in white's interest. Like, say, queen f3, we could bring a rook to the e file and maybe go like queen a5, queen b4, target all this stuff. White's position is really falling apart. And what happened in this game actually was just f4 without taking an e5, but still, this is not so good. We exchanged another set of pieces, knight e7, very nice move. Open this diagonal for the bishop, and after the following moves, queen b6, threatening the b2 pawn, and after white protected with rook b1, going queen b4. The whole point being that, you know, if, you know, white does engage in this queen trade, now they have to move the knight somewhere rather passive. In the meantime, black is gonna, like, I don't know, hit the e4 pawn, infiltrate for rook somewhere. It's looking pretty freaking bad for the white pieces. And after queen b4 in this game, queen f1, c4, again, black was sort of getting the very typical play on the queen side. Absolute strategic nightmare from the white perspective, but also a complete dream from the black one. So to show another scenario of bishop g4 being played, this time it's going to be a bit more from the white perspective. Again, something like castles is going to lead to takes, and some position like this where black isn't doing too bad. As white, you don't really want this. Typically, if you're offered the option, you have bishop on e2 and you hit with bishop g4. Basically, 99% of the time, at least from what I've observed, you want to play knight d2 actually, and allow a bishop exchange like this, because now the point is that it might seem a bit strange, because very often we're told like, oh, but you get the bishop here like this, so this should be the one you go for. Well, sort of yes, but also no. And there's sort of two reasons for this. One is that, you know, our bishop, because it's a light squared one, is just sort of hemmed up against all our pawns, is sort of, you know, biting its head against it, hoping that one day it gets to have a life, but it never will, at least if black plays correctly. And also that when you play knight d2, now when, you know, this exchange occurs, our knight has a very clear future role, which is to eventually go to a square like c4 and put some pressure on the black queen side. Whereas when we, you know, engage in this whole thing, not only do we not get knight d2, knight c4, but our bishop is also deflected away from the queen side, where it exerts some influence over there. So yeah, usually if you're playing this with the white pieces and you have this sort of opportunity to play like knight d2 and exchange off the light squared bishops and avoid this bishop takes f3 trade, do that. And if you're off the black pieces and your opponent doesn't understand this, exploit it and just take the damn thing. So generally in the Benoni, right, you know, we've seen how black loves to play stuff like on the queen side with b5, and, you know, sometimes white will play positionally there. But, you know, one of the main plans, which we briefly talked a little bit about in this video, or only seen like tangentially in other lines, is white simply going for this break e4 to e5. Sometimes there will also be a pawn f4 to support that. In this particular game there wasn't, but basically if white is able to achieve this break under good circumstances, black is usually doing quite poorly. So the black player always has to be sort of aware and on the lookout for these sorts of possibilities. E4 happened in this game, and what white did was he played a very active but also somewhat weakening looking move to some players perhaps, which is g4. But this is actually a very common idea in the Benoni sometimes, is to kick this knight out of the h5 square, and in particular in this game it was to bring also the bishop to f4, which it you know, for knight and h5 wasn't able to do. And already at this point, it was actually just very difficult for black. I think they messed up at some point. I think, like, for example, after g4, they had to play this very precise move h6. Now, with the idea that, you know, if takes, well, black rather wins the white dark square bishop, which is an incredibly important piece in all these, you know, variations where black has this fianchetto dark square bishop. Because, like, sure, you can maybe win a pawn with something like takes, knight takes g5, but the dark squares are just so damn weak. And after something like, I don't know, knight e5, bring the queen to f4, just swing all the pieces over to the king side, like, that's gonna sting a lot more than just being down a pawn. White is really gonna regret grabbing that fin, which is why something like bishop e3 is probably better. And now if we go for a similar line now, black actually has this move knight h7, which was created this square, this little hole for the knight, by playing once again this move h6. And now white cannot play what they played in the game with e5 because the square is under adequate control. Like after bishop f4, now there's essentially no way that black had to actually prevent e5. They played b5, but after takes e5, white broke through and just simply had a very substantial advantage in this position with the protected passed d pawn. Another very common idea involving the e5 break is where white actually sacrifices the pawn. This is a line we've been talking about briefly earlier with bishop b5 check. Bishop e2 I don't know as well. I know there's like the main lines like to go a4 or something, or bishop d3, but bishop e2 I'm not as familiar with, I have to admit. Nonetheless, this all occurred. Knight f8 in this position. Bit of a strange looking move. I don't know actually if this is like a legitimate idea or whether the black player just didn't know what they were doing in this game. But I imagine maybe the problem was with going to f6 or something like this was that you get hit with e5 and this might be a bit painful. But nonetheless, after knight f8, you might think e5 isn't really a thing, but it was actually just played anyway. And the idea here, I suppose, was that, you know, if takes, at the very least we could just take on e5 and win the dark square bishop, which would significantly weaken the black king side. And after knight bd7, what white did was also very interesting. They played knight g5, and after d takes e5, take note of this is a very important idea. They did not take on e5, instead they decided to play this move f5, which has a couple effects. One is that we want to, you know, take maybe and open up the f file for this rook. And we also do so in a way, like you might say, but we could open it up immediately, but that wouldn't be as fun because now they can take on e5 with a piece, this bishop remains open diagonal, whereas after f5, neither of those things are true. It's a lot more difficult to get this bishop into the game, and you also can't really just easily put a knight onto a square like so. E5, not to mention it becomes a lot more difficult to activate this knight squared bishop and whatnot. Knight f6 is played in the game, but g4 once again locking this knight squared bishop in, and after h6, knight e4. This is sort of the position that I want you guys to have in your minds when you think about this whole, like, you know, e5 pawn sacrifice where you go f5. Also, I should note that you don't want to really play f5 here. This doesn't really make sense because this bishop takes f5. There sort of needs to be a knight on d7, or at least not a bishop being able to take there to make this whole thing work. But yeah, like this whole position, this is just a complete strategic nightmare for black. Strong knight in e4, bishop that can't move, locked in dark side bishop, sort of weak kingside, you could argue. The game was very convincing from the white perspective. Just kicking all the black pieces back, slowly regrouping on the king side, a5, taking a bit of a timeout for the attack, but eventually playing king h1, bringing the rooks over to the king side. And I'll just briefly show how the game wrapped up. Queen g4, threatening mate. Black played queen g7, trying to trade off queens. White complied, and it might look like black is sort of making it out of the woods, but not quite, because after f6, bishop f8, shaboom, bishop takes h6, and you can't take because rook h3, and if you go king h7, there's rook g7, and you are getting mated no matter what. So again, another very sort of typical looking Benoni position. It's black to move. They played 95 in the game, creating some immediate tension, forking the bishop and queen. And if white just plays something like queen e2, black can trade closer towards edge in position. We saw something very similar like this in a game played by Tal earlier. So what happened in this game was white instead decided to take on e5. And you know, you don't really want to play d takes e5 because for one, d6 maybe is a bit of an issue. Maybe white could also play more positionally like a5 rather, develop or maneuver a knight into a4, put pressure on c5 square, flirt with the idea of going to b6 maybe. So you know, positionally from that point of view, black doesn't usually want to take unless once again they can get a knight to d6 very quickly. So that's why in this position they played rook takes e5, probably the strongest move as well. But you always have to be very careful. This is why I wanted to point out of going for something like this where you get a knight into e5 and you have to recapture it with a piece on the e5 square, that you're not just getting kicked away very quickly with something like f4 and something like this with knight d7 e5, because now white has basically just asserted complete dominance in the center, and you might be wondering what happens if takes. Black wanted that to win the game. They took the pawn, but then they got brutally murdered after d6. queen c6 takes, sorry, not takes immediately, queen c8 now takes, sacking a piece, but the problem is now after all these moves, black is basically just dead meat, which meant that back in this position they shouldn't have played knight d7 actually, because of this whole thing. Very cool pawn sacrifice once again. And instead what black should have done was they should have played rook a d8 actually, despite, you know, the knight going to d7, monitoring the e5 square. It actually didn't stop it, but now, you know, something like e5 just doesn't really work. This doesn't lead anywhere, so black would probably be doing okay in this position. But again, as always, be careful when you're playing knight e5 and looking out for the very concrete things like just this, of course. But there's a nice example showing some times where white actually has to be a bit careful of doing something like that. This was a game where black played knight e5, takes happened, and after f4 it might look like white is on the verge of winning, because if we just bring our rook backwards, e5, and oh my god, this is terrible, oh no, and I want to cry and stuff. But after f4 actually this turns out to just be a big mistake. Black sort of capitalized it on the game. They didn't follow it up in the correct way, but they took on g5 actually. They sack an exchange, but again, as I'm going to talk about again and again, and I've already talked about many times in Benoni, this is what you sometimes have to do when you play this opening. You have to play a very concrete manner, very dynamic. If you just play sort of one passive move, you're dead meat. You can't afford to play like a pussy when you play the Benoni. You have to play very proactively. And that's what black did in the game. They played very proactively, sacrificing an exchange on g5, and after takes, they played knight h5, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, at the very least compared to something more forward like knight g4, which now targets some crucial squares in the white camp. Friends bishop d4 check, followed by knight f2 and whatnot, also queen takes g5, the usual stuff. And despite being exchanged down, black is just completely, I'm not sure winning, but definitely according to the computer it's winning, but maybe in practice white can put up some resistance, but definitely white's in trouble. And on a similar note of talking about knight e5 ideas, what I'm going to show now is actually a position where the knight is on d2 already, and we can go knight e5 with tempo, but we have to always be careful, because once again, like, if we just play a slow move, we're gonna get kicked out with something like f4. Maybe not in this exact position, because maybe knight g4 is a possibility, but even still, maybe we have to be careful with knight f3, h3, g4, kicking our knight back into who knows where. So essentially what black's idea is, and at least what they did in this game, was they played this move g5, which looks very anti-positional as it weakens the f5 square, and that is something we have to watch out for in many of these variations. However, the more important idea, apart from just the weakening features of what we've just done, is that we control the f4 square in such a way now that white, if they want to play f4, they also weaken some of their dark squares. This pawn is now technically a backward one. It doesn't have any support from the f pawn, which, you know, sort of makes it a lot less strong, I guess is the way to put it. And in the game what we saw was this very typical sort of regrouping from the black pieces. Rook e1, knight g6, bishop f1. I'm not so sure I understand this completely. I think also in this game white didn't play it the best way. Very often what happens is something like knight f1, knight g3, again knight coming to f5 maybe, but okay, bishop f1, knight g4, knight c4, bishop d4, threatening the f2 pawn. It's possible at this point white had already screwed up a bit, queen f6, just ignoring the fact this knight is on pre, because if you take enough times, eventually you bond the mate, which is always nice. And if bishop takes g4, queen c2, again, we're just jumping into the dark squares, controlling all these guys. You can't really kick us out, because then we go here, and if you take, you know, we're gonna do this, and maybe white can stop it somehow, but nonetheless, I think we can all agree this is really freaking unpleasant for the white pieces. But you know what white did in the game, it still wasn't very good. They tried playing bishop e3, we keep the darks with e5, f3, bishop d7, and just notice how, you know, black has perfectly blockaded the darks with, maybe not perfectly, but you know, we have our pieces darks with like this, our bishop lined up against their sort of weak h2 pawn, and you know, white supposedly, even though they're the ones supposed to be making the advances on the king side, in this position that's just not the case, and they're really sort of struggling to find any sort of productive plan in the position, and for that reason they're just sort of much worse. And continuing off on that note of sort of attacking plans on the king side for black, we're going to be looking briefly at what I'd probably call the sandwich variation. There's of course the sandwich variation of the King's Indian, where white puts a pawn on f3, and actually this very often leads to a transposition later down the road, where like there's a bunch of moves for white in this position, say like bishop e3, knight e2, bishop g5 as well. But against all of those, a very common line for black is to go c5 rather than d5, go for e6 take, and we get a transposition to these Benoni type positions, say this one where you know, with the following moves, knight g3 can happen. And, you know, one sort of thing about the same variation is that, you know, white seeks to definitely limit black's counterplay in some senses, because the e4 pawn is very well protected. It's difficult for us to attack that and go for our sort of standard plans. So one thing we often do is we will play like h5, for example, to destabilize the knight on g3, and then say we're able to kick this away eventually. One thing we're going to do is we're going to go for this f5 break. And this is what I want to talk about here. A very typical break in a lot of Benoni positions, especially in the same variation. This is one of the most important ones to understand. Where basically in an ideal world, what we're going to do is we're going to play f4, sort of create a bit of a blockade on the dark squares, put our knight in e5 or something like that, swing our pieces like a queen over to g5, maybe h3, and create some serious pressure over there. However, usually white will instead play something like e takes f5, g takes f5, and we have some really weird, unclear position that you'll need to study more on your own if you really want to understand this. Trying to explain what's going on would take a lot more than just 2 minutes or 30 seconds, and a long YouTube video like this where I have to cover a lot of different topics. But yeah, just understand some of these key ideas, like going h5, especially with the knight on g3, right? If there was no knight on g3, h5 doesn't really make sense. But yeah, also more importantly, then like once we kick that knight away, we don't really want to go for like f5, by the way, with a knight on g3 like this. It doesn't make much sense. It controls the square very nicely, at least from what I can sort of understand about the position. So yeah, that is that. Coming back to this position, however, another idea which also exists and looks quite strange, and you know, if this makes you very uncomfortable, you don't necessarily have to go for it. It's probably not even the objectively best option in this position, but it helps to know this sort of thing exists, I think, in the opening, is where black can play knight h5. And it's not just specific to this variation, by the way. I'll show another example, actually a game from Bobby Fischer, where he took on the structure in a slightly different position, but nonetheless to show some ideas. But yeah, basically the point is that after takes, yeah, sure, we have doubled h points, and that looks really bad just on the surface level. However, things really aren't that simple in reality. For one thing, we can sort of push our h pawn, create some weaknesses in the white camp like so, but also we sort of just remove the annoying knight from g3 in some sense, and that sort of frees us up to do our own like f5 break once again, which is very often coming in the next two moves. Sometimes first bringing knight to e5 and then going to f5, but also to show the game that I was just talking about, right? With the very similar idea, Bobby actually just played knight h5 in this position. This was actually from a very famous game in the World Championship match, the 1972 one, where he played against Spassky. He played this knight h5 move, where he seemingly just allows Spassky, and Spassky did end up taking on h5, and we get this sort of pawn structure where, again, doubled h pawns looks very ugly on the surface, but in reality is actually quite playable for black once again. And one plan which very often black will just go for, and Fischer actually went for in the game, is just bring a queen to h4, a knight to e5, jump into g4, and create some just very crude threats on the Kingside. And, you know, that's what happened. Knight c4, knight e5, again, as I've been talking about a bunch of times, you want to be careful about just exchanging pieces. In this case, black's wrecked their structure a little bit, so there might be something in it for white, but again, you want to be careful about these exchanges. So Spassky, he played knight e3, queen h4, bishop d2, knight g4, takes, and he played bishop f4, sort of attacking the d6 pawn and also keeping an eye on the h2 pawn. Fischer played the queen f6, and this is where, you know, Spassky made a really serious mistake. He played this move g3, and after bishop d7, Bobby just had a very comfortable game. He ended up expanding on the queen side of b5, and at this point had a very good position. So now for the final section, and also the shortest one of this video. Not going to be talking too long. We're going to be talking about some miscellaneous things like move orders. I know, how exciting, but in this position, say for example, like white doesn't play c4, they might play knight f3. This is something that's actually very annoying for many Benoni players, because they want to play c5, and then after, you know, like something like this, like, oh, we transpose. However, there's sort of a problem with this exact one, in that white will play knight c3, and then we talked about some similar positions earlier, right, with a pawn on c4, and we talked about, not that, this one where, you know, this isn't so good for white when they take on d5. However, the small difference of simply in this position of the knight on f3 being developed, and in this position there being a pawn on c4 and the knight back on g1, is actually quite substantial, and makes this position compared to this one, you know, being for black, of course, definitely fine, whereas this one is actually quite unpleasant, and probably something that if I were a Benoni player, I would not want to go into, and I would instead in this position consider going for something, for example, like e6, with the idea being that now with c4, c5, d5, and we transpose to the good old Benoni. However, you also have to consider something like maybe e3, which is a very sort of boring sideline, and you can't really play the Benoni now. You have to do something like takes and d5, and you're actually in a Caro-Kann panel variation. Or you could play something like d5 without taking, and now you're in sort of like a Tarrasch, semi-Tarrasch thing where white's played e3, and you're doing completely fine. But again, when you play the Benoni, is this what you want? Not really, but you know, this is sort of something you have to bite the bullet with and consider when you're going to play the Benoni and your opponent doesn't give you everything you want. Something that's also worth considering as well is that potentially one backup weapon that some Benoni players, some modern Benoni players would enjoy, and I say modern Benoni very intentionally there because the Benoni can be a couple different things. Like for example, in this position, g6 is also Benoni, but this isn't really a modern Benoni where you immediately play e6, take on d5. This one is often called a slow Benoni, and I studied it a bit like a couple years ago. I played it a bit, never played it OTB, but it's definitely a decent opening. And there's, you know, some benefits. One is that you don't have as much immediate confrontation in the center. A con, however, is that say if you play e6 in some of these positions, you have to be familiar with another structure aside from just the one in the modern Benoni, which is this one, the so-called asymmetric Benoni. At least that's what it was called in this well-known book, Chess Structures, Grandmaster Guide, but also the symmetric Benoni instead of the asymmetric Benoni with e takes d5. So yeah, keep this in mind. And also one thing I'll say also is that another benefit actually of playing this spin is that you sometimes can go for e5, or you can play like knight e6, and you can keep the tension and sort of morph the structure into something which your opponent is less likely to be familiar with, which again is something that I quite like about the slow Benoni. It can be good for definitely outplaying weaker opponents who often tend to not be as familiar with these very close strategic type of position. And the final thing we're going to be talking about in this video is transpositions from the King's Indian. This might be relevant to some of you watching this, where, you know, if you want to play the Benoni structures, a lot of the times people are all sort of stuck up in going like e5 and all, you know, I want to go for my Kingside attacking plan because I saw some like Garry Kasparov game or something like that. But also just as valid is actually, maybe not just as valid, maybe it's not quite as sound, but c5 is definitely a playable option, one that I play in Blitz Online. And basically the point is if white plays d5, now we're in business, we have a Benoni structure. Again, we have to contend with the fact that they might not play c takes d5, they also have e takes d5, and also that they actually don't even have to go for d5 here, they could also just play castles, and now after c takes, we're in a completely different opening actually. This is a Maroczy bind, which can often arise from the accelerated dragon, among other openings. But there are a lot of opening lines where going for c5 instead of e5 is actually the best option. For example, one that immediately comes to mind is like the so-called Smyslov variation, where it's sort of known to be best that instead of going for something like d6, knight b7, e5, the black should actually go for like d6, c5, for example, or just c5 immediately in this position and then later play d6, which, you know, would often invite these sort of Benoni structures. So yeah, definitely, like, not just this video is useful for Benoni players, also for people who, I mean, of course, play 1d4 because you have to play the Benoni if you play 1d4, but also for maybe black players who play the King's Indian, because there are a lot of scenarios. I mean, technically you can avoid going to the Benoni, I guess, if you want, but there are many scenarios in which it's objectively best to do so, or at the very least it will introduce some sort of variety into your play rather than going for the same stale attacking plan that you've played in the last 5,000 games you've played this opening. Not calling this boring, by the way, but just saying kind of is if you do it every single chess game and never change it up. But yeah, anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. That is 20 ideas, I think it's 20 at least, I'll have to check, ideas that every modern Benoni player must know. And the usual, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below about your life or whatever. And also, if you're interested in coaching, check that out. And also I have a free newsletter down in the description below that you can sign up to and receive emails about chess improvement stuff. But yeah, hope you guys all have a good day. I'll see you until next time.